I'd like to do a song that, the coming of spring or the sun rising, something like that. Joy, pure, existence, you know.
Jim Morrison was not a star shaped by the formulas of the music industry. He was the product of loneliness, inner conflict, depression, surreal poetry, and unrelenting hallucinations. In the world of rock, where rebels often get consumed by the very fire they ignite, Jim Morrison was the one who embraced the flames and stepped into them like a ritual of liberation, with curls like fire, eyes lost in a dreamlike haze, a husky voice echoing from the subconscious, and cryptic poetry woven through hypnotic electric chords. Morrison didn't perform, he conjured. He didn't just sing to the crowd, he led them through a different door of perception, where beauty and death walked hand in hand like two sides of the same coin. In just 6 brief years with the Doors, Jim Morrison turned himself into a living symbol of absolute freedom, seductive self-destruction, and defiant artistry. But then in 1971, at the age of 27, he died. A death too quiet, too murky, too sudden for the world to truly grasp who he was. How could a man addicted to alcohol, convicted of lewd behavior, known for rolling on stage in delirium, be buried among Oscar Wilde and Edith Piaf, and be revered worldwide as a spiritual icon of rock? Join us as we trace that strange and brutally beautiful journey, from a lonely boy haunted by visions of Native Americans to the Dionysus of rock and roll, and finally to a soul that vanished without saying goodbye. Because if you've ever craved freedom so deeply that you'd risk losing everything, then you'll understand why Jim Morrison never really left. Early life. Jim Morrison wasn't born under stage lights, but within the gray walls of a military household, where emotions were boxed in and affection was something to be rationed. He came into the world on December 8, 1943, in Melbourne, Florida, while America was deep in the throes of World War II. His father, George Stephen Morrison, was a stern Navy officer who would later become an admiral and command the Pacific Fleet during the Gulf of Tonkin incident. His mother, Clara Clark Morrison, was a quiet woman, driven more by duty than emotion. Jim's childhood was a revolving door of relocations: Florida, California, Texas, Virginia. Each stop was just a waiting room, no lasting friendships, no memories long enough to hold on to. While other kids played ball outside, Jim buried himself in books. Nietzsche, Rimbaud, Kerouac, William Blake. Those were his real worlds. A 10-year-old who could quote existential poetry but didn't know how to say "I miss you" out loud. Then came the incident, one Morrison would recall for the rest of his life as a spiritual turning point. In 1947, at just 4 years old, while driving through the New Mexico desert with his family, they came upon a horrific accident. A truck carrying Native Americans had crashed, bodies strewn across the road. Jim saw it all and believed their souls had entered him. Years later, in the song Peace Frog, he wrote, "Indians scattered on dawn's highway, bleeding. Ghosts crowd the young child's fragile eggshell mind." The boy didn't know it then, but that haunting would follow him for life. In poetry, in music, in alcohol, in LSD, in every scream he let loose into a crowd. It never left him. Just as his parents never truly were with him, even while they were alive. Jim's relationship with his family grew so fractured that he would later declare himself an orphan. In the Doors' first press kit, he wrote, "My parents are dead." When asked, he simply shrugged. Spiritually, that's true. No one ever really taught Jim Morrison how to grow up. What he did learn was how to be free, and he paid the price for it himself. Early career. No one knows exactly when Jim Morrison decided he would become an artist. Perhaps it was one night, alone under a dim light, reading Rimbaud in French and imagining himself as a figure suspended between dream and madness. But by 1964, when he enrolled in the film program at UCLA, the path toward art had become irreversible. At UCLA, Jim quickly set himself apart. He had no interest in commercial or entertainment films, immersing himself instead in the works of Jean Cocteau, Fellini, and Bergman. He created surreal short films rich in symbolism and metaphor, works that professors often deemed aesthetically dangerous and too obscure. But to Jim, art wasn't about pleasing others. It was about dissecting the inner world. That inner world, dense with poetry, existential philosophy, LSD, sex, and shadow, began spilling beyond the page. After graduating in 1965, Jim Morrison cut all ties with his family, drifting aimlessly, living on the rooftop of a friend's house in Venice Beach. He barely ate, surviving day to day, and filled notebooks with thick lines of poetry. Break on through, end of night, riders on the storm. Nearly all the songs that would one day become legendary were written during this wild, untethered period. In Venice Beach, Jim crossed paths again with Ray Manzarek, a former UCLA film classmate turned musician. When Jim read a few verses aloud, including the line, "Let's swim to the moon, let's climb through the tide," Ray froze. He knew he had just heard something rock music had never encountered before. Not just lyrics, but a revelation. The two formed a band, later joined by Robbie Krieger, guitar, and John Densmore, drums, creating The Doors. The name came from Aldous Huxley's The Doors of Perception, itself quoting William Blake. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. It wasn't just a band name, it was a life manifesto. The Doors quickly gained attention in the Los Angeles nightclub circuit, especially at Whiskey A Go-Go and London Fog. They had no bass player. Their sound dug deep into the psyche through Manzarek's swirling organ, Krieger's sliding guitar, Densmore's unconventional drumming, and above all, Morrison's voice, as if a spirit was singing through human lips. But it wasn't just the music. On stage, Jim didn't perform. He transcended. He sang like he was reading poetry, writhing, screaming, crying, moaning, drifting. Some shows ended with Morrison collapsed on the floor, the audience both mesmerized and disturbed. The turning point came when they performed The End, an 11-minute epic that closed with a chilling suggestion of incest. "Father? Yes, son. I want to kill you. Mother, I want to... fuck you." Whiskey A Go-Go immediately banned them, but the shock rippled fast. Producer Jack Holzman of Elektra Records offered them a record deal. Their breakout hit Light My Fire dropped in 1967, and the Doors exploded overnight. Morrison, once a skinny rooftop poet in Venice, became the Dionysus of rock and roll in a single night. But no one realized that as the lights grew brighter, the darkness inside him was growing far less controllable. Career success. In 1967, when the Doors released their debut album, the music world already had its palette. The Beatles sang of love, Bob Dylan of protest, Janis Joplin of pain. But no one sang like Jim Morrison. He didn't tell stories, he opened a door. And behind that door was a world so dark, desolate, and surreal that listeners didn't know whether to be afraid or entranced. Light My Fire exploded across radio waves like a signal from another planet. Morrison's deep, raspy voice, like a seance calling someone back from the dead, merged with Ray Manzarek's haunting organ to create a sound that felt part seduction, part ritual. It launched the Doors to the top of the Billboard charts, turned Jim Morrison into a cultural phenomenon, and ignited a 6-year journey that was short-lived, but as intense as an electric storm. Success didn't arrive step by step. It hit like a wave. Within months, the Doors went from nightclub regulars to the eye of the media storm, fan obsession, and collective fascination. But Morrison didn't welcome fame as glory. He accepted it the way one might receive an omen of apocalypse. Every time he stepped on stage, he wasn't performing. He was exercising. There was no boundary between artist and breakdown. He sang like he was possessed, recited poetry like in a trance, collapsed on the stage floor as if trying to touch the bottom of his own abyss. Between rapid-fire album releases, from Strange Days to Waiting for the Sun, The Soft Parade to Morrison Hotel, Morrison kept challenging listeners with cryptic, haunting, and symbolic lyrics. He led them into a maze with People Are Strange, where alienation wasn't fear, it was human nature. He tore down every mask with Break On Through to the Other Side, a call to obliterate the boundary between real and imagined, reason and instinct. And then, in the end, he guided the world into a 10-minute ritual of darkness, where death, sex, and destruction merged into one, over a soundscape that seemed to echo from the mass grave of a lost generation. The final peak came with L.A. Woman, an album soaked in blues, heavy with the scent of farewell. In the title track, Morrison howled, "Mr. Mojo Risin'," an anagram of his own name, like a personal cipher. Riders on the Storm closed the album with rolling thunder and a voice that seemed to drift in from the afterlife. There was something in that recording that made your skin crawl, as if Morrison knew this would be the last time he would inhabit sound. In those brief 6 years, the Doors weren't just a band. They were an experience, a ceremony, a doorway into the darkest chambers of the human psyche. And Jim Morrison, with all his beauty, destruction, and faraway stare like someone half living in another dimension, was the one holding the key. Not everyone dares to walk through that door, but once you do, you never return the same. Scandals and shadows. No one steps through a door of consciousness without getting hurt. For Jim Morrison, every performance was a battle, and every battle left scars on his mind, on his reputation, and on the legend he could no longer control. If success came to the Doors like a storm, its aftermath was an undercurrent pulling Morrison down, caught in the fragile space between genius and self-destruction. To the public, Morrison was rock's poet prodigy. But behind the scenes, he was a nightmare for promoters. He drank before shows, lost control on stage, often interrupted songs to recite poetry mid-set, or rolled on the floor in trance-like states, as if communing with demons. Audiences no longer knew if they were attending a concert or witnessing a public unraveling. Then came the night of March 1st, 1969, in Miami, the biggest scandal of Morrison's career. Drunk and erratic, he arrived late, insulted the crowd, simulated masturbation, removed his shirt, and was accused of exposing himself to thousands. No photo or video ever confirmed the act, but the accusations alone were enough for the media to crucify him. The police got involved. Morrison was convicted of public lewdness, fined, and faced a 6-month jail sentence. From cultural icon, he became a moral threat in the headlines and lost nearly all opportunities to perform in the U.S. That incident was more than a legal blow. It marked a psychological rupture. Morrison began to deteriorate from within. He was no longer the handsome, curly-haired, magnetic frontman of earlier days. He gained weight, grew a thick beard, refused promotional photos, and sank deeper into alcohol, marijuana, LSD, and, some speculate, heroin, though he never admitted it. Addiction didn't just ravage his body, it corroded his once unshakable grip on the inner forces that had allowed him to become without being consumed. Alongside the drugs and alcohol, Morrison became entangled in a web of rumors about his sexuality, violent relationships, and mystical rituals. He once declared he didn't belong to any category and wanted to try everything a human could endure. Whispers claimed he had affairs with poet Michael McClure, had offered himself to the devil for inspiration, or believed he was the reincarnation of a Native American shaman who died in the desert. None of it could be confirmed, and none of it could be entirely denied. Tensions within the Doors grew. Though the other members still loved and respected Morrison, They often clashed over his growing instability. At times, they considered replacing him or having him write lyrics but step away from performing. But everyone knew, without Jim Morrison, the Doors were no longer the Doors. And perhaps Morrison knew that too, and resented it. In one interview, he said, "I'm sick of being Jim Morrison. I don't know who he is anymore. But everyone wants him to show up every night, drunk, insane, ready to die in front of them." Deep down, Morrison didn't want to be an entertainer. He wanted to be a poet, a consciousness explorer, a free soul. But when the world only wanted him to put on a show, his only act of defiance was to burn himself out, little by little, with every performance, every bottle, every scream filled with things no one dared to hear. And the most tragic part? The world kept clapping. The mysterious death. Paris, summer 1971. After a string of scandals, blood-soaked concerts, and a looming court sentence, Jim Morrison vanished from the spotlight. He left America with no announcement, no farewell show, no parting song. Alongside his longtime girlfriend Pamela Corson, he rented a small apartment at 17 Rue Beautreillis in the heart of the Latin Quarter, where poets and wandering souls had once carved out the history of French literature. But Morrison didn't come to live again. He came to disappear. In Paris, he didn't record, he didn't perform, he did no press. He spent hours walking through Père Lachaise Cemetery, where Oscar Wilde, Edith Piaf, and Marcel Proust lay buried. He told Pamela, "If I die, bury me here." By night, he wrote poetry. By day, he drank. Friends who saw him during that time recalled a man heavier, slower, but more silent than ever, as if Morrison had stopped screaming and was waiting for something final. On July 3, 1971, Pamela found Jim motionless in the bathtub. His heart had stopped. There were no signs of trauma, no struggle, no wounds. The death certificate cited heart failure, but no autopsy was performed. Under French law, one isn't required unless foul play is suspected. And so, Jim Morrison, the lead singer of The Doors, a symbol of a generation, was quietly buried 3 days later. No funeral, no family, no fellow bandmates. It all happened so quietly, it was hard to believe. No one besides Pamela and a few friends saw the body. No photos, no independent coroner, no official investigation. The news came late and in fragments. And then the whirlwind of rumors began. Jim Morrison didn't die. He staged his death to vanish from the world. He overdosed on heroin in a nightclub, not in a bathtub. He was poisoned. He committed suicide. He had planned his exit all along. None of it was ever confirmed. Pamela, the only one who knew the truth, died 3 years later from a heroin overdose. She was 27, and what she took to the grave wasn't just her own life, but the final truth about Jim Morrison's death. Yet even in death, Jim wrote another chapter of his myth. His grave at Père Lachaise, with a small nameless stone, no inscription, became a pilgrimage site for millions. Fans left behind poems, flowers, wine, lighters, and tears. They didn't come to mourn a singer, but to connect with a soul that never agreed to rest. After his death, L.A. Woman became a musical last will. Riders on the Storm played like a prophecy, rain falling, thunder rolling, a quiet guitar, and Morrison's voice whispering from somewhere far away. The Doors released a few more albums, but they never recaptured the old spirit. And the world began to look back. Maybe, just maybe, they hadn't listened closely enough while Jim was alive. To some, Jim Morrison was a paranoid drunk. To others, he was rock's last true poet. But whatever you believe, his death remains a void that cannot be filled. A question with no answer. A goodbye no one heard. And strangely, because there was never a final word, Jim Morrison never truly left this world. Personal life. Jim Morrison never tried to be easily understood, in his music, in his philosophy, or in love. To most of the world, he was an untamed sex symbol, a magnetic figure in tight leather pants, and a gaze lost somewhere between alcohol and poetry. But beyond the stage lights and dorm room posters, his private life was a tangled loop of contradiction, a yearning for connection, forever pushing others away. His longest and most controversial relationship was with Pamela Corson, the woman he called his cosmic wife, though they were never officially married. They met at a bar in Los Angeles in 1965, when Pamela was just 19. She had the aura of a post-beat muse, fragile, wild, and irresistibly alluring to Jim. But theirs was no fairy tale romance. It was a long spiral of intoxication, jealousy, violence, reconciliation, breakups, and inevitable reunions. Two people addicted to each other more than to the drugs and alcohol that surrounded them. Jim slept with many others, models, journalists, fans, but always returned to Pamela as if she were the final stop, no matter how scorched it became. And Pamela, though painfully aware of the betrayals, stayed, not out of weakness, but perhaps because she was the only one who could see the storm beneath his skin. Beyond Pamela, Morrison also had a complex bond with Patricia Kennealy, a music journalist and writer fascinated by poetry and Celtic witchcraft. The two even held a Celtic hand-fasting ceremony with real witnesses, though not legally binding. Kennealy believed Morrison truly loved her and claimed to have once been pregnant with his child, later choosing to terminate the pregnancy, knowing he couldn't be a father. That relationship ended bitterly, and in her memoirs years later, Kennealy still called Jim the greatest love and longest obsession of my life. Outside of love, Morrison's personal life was a sequence of self-interrogation. He was both a peace-seeking dreamer and a volatile rebel who couldn't control his rage. Once he smashed a recording machine against the wall during a session over a minor disagreement. Another time, he sat for hours in silence, just watching the light filter through a crack in the door, writing a poem only he could ever fully understand. Morrison never made clear whether he wanted to be a father, to marry, or what family even meant to him. He lived as though every form of attachment was a shackle, including love. And for every woman who entered his life, the experience was like walking a tightrope between ecstasy and destruction. After Morrison's death, Pamela inherited his entire estate, just as he had outlined in his will. But 3 years later, she too died of a heroin overdose at the age of 27 in a small Hollywood apartment. Their love was never whole, their time together marked by chaos and longing, but in the end, they left this world as if there was never going to be a tomorrow. If Jim Morrison was fire, Pamela was the one who chose to burn with it. Jim left behind no children, no legal marriage, no close family ties, but perhaps every song he wrote was a personal journal entry, a confession from a soul that no one could ever fully hold. And when people sing the end, "Love Me 2 times," or "Touch Me," what they're hearing is not just music. It's the voice of a man who desperately wanted to be loved, but never quite believed he deserved it. Legacy and influence. Jim Morrison didn't live long enough to witness himself become a legend, but perhaps that's exactly what made the legend eternal. When he died at 27, many assumed the Doors would fade into obscurity, a name tied to scandal, substances, and a few rebellious hits. But they were wrong. Decades later, from radio stations to streaming playlists, from dusty record shops in San Francisco to candlelit tribute concerts across Europe, the Doors' music and Jim Morrison's haunting voice still echo untouched by time. Because Jim never wrote to be relevant. He wrote as if he were peeling back human consciousness, one layer at a time. Morrison's influence went far beyond music. He brought surrealist poetry and existential philosophy into pop culture, making rock listeners ponder Nietzsche, Blake, Rimbaud, not through textbooks, but through songs like The End or When the Music's Over. He didn't just sing, he asked, "Who are we? What is freedom? Is death a release?" And though those questions remain unanswered, they still haunt us. Generations of artists, from Iggy Pop and Patti Smith to Kurt Cobain and Eddie Vedder, have acknowledged learning from Morrison how to inject personal truth, insecurity, and raw sensuality into music without asking for permission. He is often credited as a pioneer of art rock and gothic rock, genres where rock becomes introspection, a language for misfits and spiritual unrest. Beyond music, Morrison's poetry was published posthumously in collections like The Lords and the New Creatures, Wilderness and The American Night, prompting critics to reconsider him not just as a rock star who dabbled in verse, but as a genuine poet who simply happened to recite his words between drums and guitars. His grave at Père Lachaise has become a cultural site, not just for rock fans, but for writers, artists, and drifters around the world. They come not to mourn, but to feel that once a soul existed who dared to live so truthfully, it burned. But perhaps Jim Morrison's greatest legacy isn't measured in records sold, awards won, or lines quoted in academia. It lies in something simpler, the belief that art, when taken to its deepest edge, can make people see themselves, if only for a moment. And Morrison gave the world that moment, just once, and it was enough to never be forgotten. Jim Morrison didn't live to become a legend. He lived like time was a luxury he never had, like every day might be the end. And that urgency, that wildness, that unrepeatable flame is etched into everything he did. In 6 brief years with the Doors, he opened a door no one had dared to before, a door that led inward, where light and darkness no longer had boundaries. He wasn't a singer, he was a ritual, not a celebrity, but a spiritual event. He didn't just write songs, he transcribed the primal loneliness of a generation that no longer believed in God, no longer believed in war, and no longer knew what else to believe in. And then he vanished, like a question never answered. No farewell song, no final concert. Just a quiet, rainy morning in Paris and a name hurriedly carved into a white stone. But maybe Jim Morrison never needed a goodbye, because what he left behind doesn't live in words. It lives in the silence between 2 lyrics, in a dazed stare, in the final whisper of riders on the storm, in the chill that runs through your spine when someone sings the end. Some artists are remembered because they lived long and left much, but then there are those, like Jim Morrison, who only needed to burn once to leave their mark on history, on our minds, and in the deepest corners of our souls. Do you remember the first time you heard The Doors? A song, a lyric, a moment that made you feel Jim Morrison wasn't just a singer, but a part of your memory? Share it with us in the comments below, because sometimes your feeling might just be the answer Jim is still quietly waiting for.